She weighed less than 50 kilograms and barely reached the shoulder of the average German soldier. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a quiet voice. The Nazis looked at her and saw one of their own. They had no idea they were staring into the face of a Jewish spy who would single-handedly crack open the defensive shield of the Third Reich in the final months of the war. Her name was Martha Hoffnun. And this is not a movie. This happened. Martha grew up in Metz, a city that sat directly on the border between France and Germany, a city that changed hands between empires so many times that its people learned to speak both languages just to survive. For Martha's Orthodox Jewish family, that border was not just geography. It was a daily reminder that they lived between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Her father ran a modest business. Her mother kept a kosher home. Her younger sister, Stephanie, followed Martha everywhere like a shadow made of laughter. Life was not easy, but it was there. Then Germany came and took everything. When the Nazis occupied France in 1940, Martha was 23 years old. What followed was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, methodical dismantling of everything she had known. Jewish families were registered, restricted, watched. The streets of Metz, where Martha had learned to walk, became streets where she was no longer fully permitted to exist. But the worst was not the laws. The worst was what happened to the people she loved most. Stephanie was arrested and deported. She died in Auschwitz. Martha never saw her again. Then came the second blow. Jacques Delaunay, the man Martha planned to marry, was a member of the French resistance. In 1943, the Nazis caught him. They executed him. Martha received the news the way people receive news that reshapes every single moment of the future. Not with screaming, but with a silence so deep it changes the texture of everything that comes after. She was 26 years old. Her sister was dead. Her fiancé was dead. Her community was being systematically destroyed around her. And in that silence, something crystallized inside Martha Hoffnun that the Nazis had not planned for and could not have predicted. She did not collapse. She did not flee. She made a decision. If the world was going to burn, she was going to do something about the fire. Martha had two things that most people in her position did not. The first was her German. Not textbook German, not careful foreign accented German, but the native, effortless, accent-perfect German of someone who had grown up in Metz, hearing it spoken on every other street corner. She could pass, completely. In a world where the wrong accent could get you killed in 30 seconds, this was not a small thing. This was everything. The second thing Martha had was her profession. She was a trained nurse. She understood bodies, pain, hospitals, medical language. She knew how to stay calm when everything around her was chaos. She knew how to make people trust her, because sick people have no energy for suspicion. They need comfort, and Martha knew how to give it. In 1944, at the age of 24, Martha did something that required a specific kind of courage most people will never be called upon to demonstrate. She walked into a French military recruitment office and enlisted. Not as a civilian, not in a support role. She joined the regular French army. The intelligence unit noticed her almost immediately. Her German was not just good, it was a weapon. The officers of the Premier Bureau, French military intelligence, understood within minutes of speaking to her that they were looking at something rare. A Jewish woman from an occupied city who sounded more German than most Germans, who had personal reasons to hate the enemy that went beyond politics, and who had the discipline and the medical training to function under pressure. They gave her a nickname almost immediately, Chichinette. It meant something like little pest or little nag, because Martha was relentless. She asked questions, she pushed back, she refused to accept limitations that seemed arbitrary to her. She argued with superior officers when she believed they were wrong. For a young woman in the French army in 1944, this was not common behavior. The men around her found it irritating. The intelligence officers found it exactly what they needed. Because the mission they were about to give her had no room for someone who would simply follow orders and hope for the best, it required someone who would think, adapt, argue with reality itself until reality gave way. Martha Hoffnun was 24 years old, barely 150 centimeters tall, and she was about to become the most unlikely intelligence asset the Allied forces had deployed against Nazi Germany. She had lost her sister. She had lost her fiancé. She had lost the life she was supposed to live. What she had left was her mind, her voice, her perfect German, and a fury so quiet and so disciplined that the Nazis would never recognize it for what it was, until it was far too late. She needed a new name, a new past, a new grief. The French intelligence officers sat with Martha and built a person from scratch. Not a spy, not a soldier, not a resistance fighter, but something far more disarming. They created a heartbroken German girl. Her new name was Martha Ulrich. Her story was simple enough to remember and painful enough to make strangers look away from asking too many questions. She was a devoted German nurse searching for her fiancé, a Wehrmacht soldier who had disappeared somewhere on the Western Front. She was lost. She was desperate. She was crying. She was utterly harmless. Everything about the legend was designed around one psychological principle that Martha and her handlers understood with cold precision. People do not interrogate grief. When a young woman is visibly falling apart over a missing loved one, the instinct of almost every human being, including German soldiers in the middle of a war, is not suspicion. It is pity. And pity makes people talk. Pity makes people offer rides in military vehicles. Pity makes officers mention, almost casually, things they would never say to someone who looked like a threat. Martha memorized every detail of her cover identity until there was no gap between Martha Hoffnun and Martha Ulrich. The backstory, the hometown, the fiancé's fictional regiment, the hospitals she had supposedly worked in. She rehearsed answers to questions she hoped no one would ask. She prepared for interrogations that she prayed would never come. This was the work, not glamorous, not dramatic, just relentless mental preparation for a situation where a single hesitation could be the last mistake she ever made. Then came the crossing, and it nearly did not happen at all. The original plan was to send Martha across the front line in Alsace. She attempted it 13 times. 13. Each attempt failed. The line was too heavily patrolled. The timing was wrong. The risk of discovery was too high. 13 times Martha prepared herself to step into enemy territory, and 13 times the mission was aborted. For most people, attempt number 2 or 3 would have broken something essential. The 14th attempt requires a kind of stubbornness that borders on pathology. Martha kept going back. In February of 1945, with the war entering its final and most chaotic months, French intelligence changed the approach entirely. Instead of crossing the front line directly, they would send Martha through Switzerland, a neutral country that bordered both France and Germany, and insert her into German territory from the south. It was a longer route, a more complicated route, but it avoided the fortified Alsatian front that had defeated her 13 previous attempts. Martha crossed into Germany in February 1945. She was 26 years old. She carried no radio. She carried no maps. She carried no weapon of any kind. Everything the Allies needed, every piece of intelligence she gathered, had to be stored inside her head and transmitted only when she found a way to make contact with her handlers. In an age before GPS, before encrypted digital communication, before any of the tools that modern intelligence agencies take for granted, Martha Ulrich walked into the heart of the dying Reich with nothing but her memory, her German accent, and a story about a missing fiancé. The psychological mechanics of what she did next were almost elegant in their simplicity. She cried. Not performance crying, not calculated weeping deployed at strategic moments. She allowed herself to inhabit the grief of her cover story completely, and that grief was not entirely fictional. She had lost a fiancé. She had lost a sister. The emotional raw material was real. She simply redirected it, wore it on the surface, and let German soldiers see a suffering young woman who reminded them of their own sisters and girlfriends waiting at home. They gave her rides. Officers in military vehicles, soldiers on patrol, men moving between positions. They saw a distressed blonde girl on the road, and they stopped. They put her in the truck. They drove her toward wherever she said she was trying to go. And while they drove, they talked. They complained about the war. They mentioned troop positions. They said things about morale, about supply lines, about where the units were thin and where the defenses were still solid. They said all of this freely because she was not a threat. She was a sad German girl, and they felt sorry for her. Martha listened to every word. She stored everything. She smiled gratefully and said nothing that mattered, and when they dropped her off, she walked away carrying information that would save Allied lives. The first major intelligence breakthrough came near Freiburg, in the region of the Siegfried Line, the massive network of German fortifications that had been built to make any Allied advance from the west feel impossible. Martha moved on foot through the area around these defenses, observing, listening, asking innocent questions in her flawless German. What she discovered was not what anyone expected. The positions were empty. The Germans had quietly abandoned significant sections of the Siegfried Line defenses near Freiburg. The fortifications that Allied commanders believed were heavily manned were in fact ghost positions. The troops had been pulled back, the guns were unmanned, and the entire defensive line in that sector was an illusion maintained by German high command to buy time and delay Allied movement. This information had to reach Allied commanders. The challenge was that Martha had no radio. She had to find a way to make contact with her handlers through the network of channels that French intelligence had established before she crossed, a fragile, slow, dangerous chain of communication that required her to reach specific locations and leave or receive messages through intermediaries. The process was agonizingly slow by the standards of modern intelligence work, but the information got through. Allied forces moved on the Freiburg section of the Siegfried Line and encountered no resistance where they had expected fierce fighting. Soldiers who might have died in that assault walked through positions that were already hollow. Martha Hoffnun, crying in the back of German military vehicles and asking strangers about her fictional missing fiancé, had saved lives she would never know about and never be able to count. The second breakthrough was more dangerous and more immediate. Martha was moving through the Black Forest, the Schwarzwald, a dense and ancient woodland that German forces were using as cover for troop movements and ambush positions. She encountered a wounded German officer who was being transported through the area. He was in pain and in low spirits, and when Martha sat with him and listened to him with the focused, calm attention that her nursing training had given her, he talked. He told her about a large German ambush that had been prepared along a specific route through the Black Forest, a trap set for Allied forces who were expected to move through that corridor. He gave her the location. He gave her the details. He gave her everything, because she was a nurse who was kind to him and a German girl who was on his side. She was not on his side. The information reached Allied commanders in time. The planned route was abandoned. Forces were redirected. The ambush, which could have killed hundreds of soldiers, was bypassed, and the German unit that had been waiting in the trees was instead surrounded and destroyed. Every one of those Allied soldiers went home after the war. Most of them never knew why their route had changed at the last minute. They never knew about the small blonde woman in a nurse's uniform who had sat with a wounded enemy officer in the Black Forest and listened to him talk himself into revealing the trap. By the time Germany surrendered in May of 1945, Martha Ulrich had ceased to exist. Martha Hoffnun walked back out of the wreckage of the Reich and returned to the world of the living, carrying in her head a record of everything she had seen, heard, and survived, and carrying in her chest the full weight of what it had cost her to do it. Part 3 of 3. 60 years of silence and a world that finally listened. When the war ended, France gave Martha Hoffnun a Croix de Guerre, the military cross, one of the highest honors the French military could bestow on a soldier. There was a ceremony. There were handshakes. There were words about bravery and sacrifice and the debt that nations owe to those who protect them. Martha accepted the medal, nodded politely, and then did something that would define the next 6 decades of her life. She went quiet. Not partially quiet. Not quiet in the way that trauma survivors sometimes go quiet, where the silence is visible and people around them understand that something unspeakable lives just beneath the surface. Martha went completely, seamlessly, invisibly quiet. She packed away Martha Ulrich and everything that name had done and seen and survived, and she stepped into an ordinary life with the same total commitment she had once brought to stepping into enemy territory. She met an American military doctor named Major Lloyd Cohn. She married him. She moved to the United States. She built a home, raised children, attended school events and dinner parties, and all the 10,000 ordinary occasions that make up a peacetime life. Her husband was a good man, an intelligent man, a man who had himself served in the war and understood something of what that generation had been through. And even he did not know. For decades, Lloyd Cohn lived beside a woman who had walked alone through Nazi Germany gathering military intelligence, and he had no idea. Their children grew up with a mother who was warm and sharp and occasionally very stubborn about things that seemed small. They did not grow up with a war hero. They did not grow up with stories of Freiburg or the Black Forest or 13 failed attempts to cross a front line in Alsace. They grew up with Mom. Just Mom. Martha believed, sincerely, without dramatics, that she had signed a lifetime oath of secrecy when she joined French military intelligence. She believed that the classified nature of her work was permanent and absolute, that speaking about it would be a betrayal of the obligations she had taken on when she was 24 years old and the world was on fire. This was not paranoia. This was Martha being Martha, the same woman who had memorized an entire intelligence legend and held it under interrogation pressure, now holding a different kind of secret with the same iron discipline. So she said nothing. For 60 years, she said nothing. The silence finally broke, not because Martha decided to confess, and not because someone found her out. It broke because of her children. As Martha moved into her 80s, she began telling her family small fragments of what she had done during the war. Not the full story, just edges, details, moments. And her children, with the gentle skepticism that adult children sometimes bring to their elderly parents' more dramatic recollections, were not entirely sure what to believe. Not because they thought their mother was dishonest, but because the story was simply too extraordinary. A Jewish girl from Metz, walking alone through Nazi Germany, feeding military intelligence to the Allies? It sounded like something from a film. Martha decided to prove it. In the late 1990s, she contacted the French military archives and requested access to her own service records. What came back confirmed everything, and then some. The documents laid out in bureaucratic, matter-of-fact military language exactly what Martha Hoffnun, known operationally as Chichinet, had accomplished during the final months of the Second World War. The missions, the intelligence she had gathered, the specific operations that her information had made possible, the Croix de Guerre she had received and then put in a drawer and never mentioned again. Her family read the documents and understood, perhaps for the first time, that they had been living with someone genuinely extraordinary without ever being given the chance to recognize it. Her children, who had heard the stories and half believed them, now held the paper proof in their hands. The woman who had made their school lunches and argued with them about homework and shown up to every ordinary moment of their lives had also, once, been the most dangerous person in a room full of Nazi officers, and none of them had known it. The world found out slowly, then all at once. Martha began speaking publicly about her wartime experience. She gave interviews. She participated in documentaries. A film called Chichenette was made about her life, the same nickname the intelligence officers had given her 70 years earlier for being so relentlessly, productively, magnificently difficult. The film introduced her story to audiences across Europe and beyond, and the reaction was the same everywhere: disbelief, followed by astonishment, followed by something that looked very much like shame that it had taken this long. France moved to correct the delay. Martha Hoffnun was awarded the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honor, the highest decoration the French Republic can give to any person, military or civilian. She received it not as a historical footnote, not as a symbolic gesture toward a forgotten war, but as a recognition that what she had done was singular and irreplaceable and had never properly been acknowledged in the scale it deserved. She was in her 90s when the medal was placed on her. She accepted it the same way she had accepted everything in her life, with composure, with dry humor, and without any visible interest in making a fuss about herself. She published her memoirs under the title Behind Enemy Lines. The book did what memoirs of genuine experience always do when they are written by someone who was actually there. It made the past feel immediate and real and terrifyingly close. Readers who had grown up in the comfort of the post-war world found themselves sitting with Martha in the back of German military trucks, listening to enemy officers talk about troop positions, holding their breath through moments where a single wrong word would have ended everything. Martha spent the final decades of her life doing something she had not done for 60 years. She talked. She gave lectures at universities and schools and cultural institutions across the world. She spoke to young people about the war, about resistance, about what ordinary human beings are capable of when history demands something extraordinary from them. She was not solemn about it. She was direct, occasionally funny, completely without self-pity. She told the truth about what she had done and what it had cost, and she let the audience draw their own conclusions about what it meant. What it meant, to most people who heard her, was something that resists easy summary. It was not simply a story about bravery, though it was certainly that. It was not simply a story about Jewish survival during the Holocaust, though it was certainly that too. It was a story about the gap between how the world sees a person and what that person is actually capable of. The Nazis looked at Martha Hoffnun and saw a small blonde girl who posed no threat. They were wrong in a way that altered the outcome of military operations, saved the lives of soldiers they were trying to kill, and outlasted their entire regime by 80 years. She was 105 years old when she died in May of 2025. 105 years of a life that had been shaped in its center by a few extraordinary months in 1945, when a young woman with no weapon and no radio and no backup walked into the heart of the dying Third Reich and listened and remembered and came home. France mourned her as a national hero. The tributes that came in described her with words like courage and legend and irreplaceable. All of those words were accurate. But perhaps the most accurate thing anyone said about Martha Hoffnun was something simpler, that she had been, from the very beginning, exactly what the Nazis had decided she could never be: dangerous.